A British company that was founded 158 years ago went bankrupt in June of 2025. This whole collapse from fully thriving, fully normal operation all the way to bankruptcy took less than 3 weeks. And the interesting thing is there was no market slowdown, no lawsuit, no debt crisis, none of those. Their customers were paying, operations were entirely normal, and one person did something so small and so trivial they probably didn't even remember it after they did it. One person at the company took an action that ended 158 years and 700 careers. Yes, 700 people lost their job. And it all came down to one thing, one single password. So the company was KNP Logistics Group. You've probably never heard of them. I hadn't either until it happened. So they're a transport company in the UK. They have around like 500 trucks moving stuff around Britain, right? And they were really, really old. They were founded in like 1867. That's 158 years. They made it through World War I, World War II, all kinds of financial crises, multiple recessions, a global pandemic, and then one password ended them in 3 weeks. If you write code or if you make technical decisions, this one's important. I want you to pay attention because I'm pretty sure some version of what killed KNB exists in systems that we're all working on right now. So yeah, let's talk about that. So we hear about like complicated and orchestrated cybersecurity attacks all the time, right? So there are zero-day exploits, sophisticated phishing campaigns, there are persistent threats. So when I first heard about the KNP attack, I was like, okay, there must be some kind of sophisticated, well-coordinated operation. But here's what happened. On June 20th, 2025, a hacking organization managed to get into KNP's system and started gaining complete access of everything. So things like hardware, database, software, they kind of systematically worked their way through the entire network, gaining access to each system one by one. And over several days, they mapped out the entire infrastructure, identified those critical systems, and deployed ransomware across everything simultaneously. So basically, ransomware is you encrypt everything and then you say, hey, you give me money and I will decrypt it. Otherwise, you lose your data. All right. So you're probably thinking, how did they pull this off? What vulnerability did they exploit? Or did they do some kind of clever social engineering? That's what I was thinking of. You want to guess how they got in? They guessed passwords, like literally tried passwords one by one until they worked. I'm not kidding. So somewhere in the world, either someone sat down and manually entered those passwords on one of the company's internet facing systems, or they had a script which does this, like the common passwords, password 123, KNP 2025, whatever, that kind of stuff. And the systems that KNP had, they just probably let them try as many times as they wanted. There was no rate limiting, there was no account lockout, there's no, hey, someone's trying to brute force this, maybe we should do something about it. And eventually, one worked because they got one valid username and password that was easy enough for them to guess and crack. Someone had set a poor password and now they were in. And okay, now I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, well, obviously they should have used password rules and multi-factor authentication. What kind of idiots don't have MFA in 2025? Well, yes, you're right. It's obviously bad practice. But let me ask you something. How many systems are there in the world today that don't have multi-factor authentication for everything? How many that you have worked on that don't have MFA for everything? How many internal tools? How many VPN endpoints? Well, the reality is a lot of companies don't have this. KNP is a 158-year-old transport company. They're not a tech company, right? Their core business is moving stuff around in trucks. So I'm guessing their IT system was probably built up over decades, right? Some modern stuff, some legacy stuff, all kinds of things kind of duct taped and put together. This kind of setup happens all the time. Okay, so maybe someone has like set up something 5 years ago and they did something for IT that was easiest at that time and just stayed that way because it worked and because changing it would be expensive and disruptive and nobody thought it was urgent. I mean, this kind of stuff happens all the time. So on June 21st, the attackers, a group called Akira, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. This is fascinating stuff. So this group called Akira, they're in and they have valid credentials. And here's what they do next. They don't immediately deploy ransomware. They spend 4 days, June 22nd to 25th. And in those 4 days, they're just exploring the network. And they're using totally normal IT admin tools like network scanners, Active Directory queries. It's the same stuff that KNP's own IT team uses. So they're using those legitimate tools and they're mapping out where everything is, right? They're mapping out where the servers are, databases, domain controllers, and critically, they're mapping where the backups are. They were basically doing this thing called lateral movement. And this is something that's used all the time by attackers after they get into systems. Here's how it works. So the initial password guess or the initial phishing attempt kind of gets them in the door, maybe to one system or one server, but that is not enough. They need to get access to all the systems. And so attackers move sideways through a network. That's why it's called lateral movement. They move from one system to another, basically escalating their access as they go. They're like island hopping through the infrastructure. But here's the critical part. They're doing this in stealth mode. They can't just smash through systems and possibly set off alarms. They need to map everything out, understand what's valuable, figure out where the backups are, all without anyone noticing that they're there. And the way they stay undetected, like I said, they use legitimate tools. They use the same network scanning tools that your IT team might use to troubleshoot problems. They make Active Directory queries that your admins might use for checking for permission, right? The same connections, the same legitimate software. So if anyone's looking at the logs, it just looks like normal IT activity. There's no obvious attack pattern. They're very careful about this. So it just looks like someone in IT doing their job. Now, because KNP's network has no segmentation, meaning that it was all just one big trust zone where any authenticated user could basically access everything. So the attackers could pretty much wander around freely. Once they were inside with valid credentials and they were using legitimate tools, they're basically invisible. They're in. So on June 26th, they deploy ransomware to everything simultaneously. And the way ransomware works is they first steal some of the data, and then they encrypt the data and leave a ransom note and say, hey, if you want this data, pay up money. And they also steal the data because in case they fight back, they have another leverage point. They can say, pay us money or we will release your data to the public, right? So there are two-pronged ways in which they attack. So these folks deployed ransomware on everything simultaneously. They deployed it on file servers, databases, domain controllers, and the backup systems. They do it so quickly that no one has time to react. So on 27th, the KNP's IT team shows up and nothing works. Everything is locked and there is a ransom note on every system and they've asked for $5 million. Now we must be thinking, oh, of course, they must have some other backup somewhere. If not, they're really asking for trouble. Well, guess what? They had backups, but the backups were on the same network. So when the attacker controlled the network, they destroyed all the backups too. Very smart, huh? Now, the company is in a situation where they cannot pay $5 million. They cannot restore from backups. So for the next 2 weeks, they bring in some cyber crisis teams. They bring forensic analysts. There is insurance which pays for the investigation, but they obviously cannot restore systems or make the trucks run. That's their business, right? Customers can't wait. They go to other logistics companies. So 22 days later, KNP enters what's called administration, which is basically the equivalent of declaring bankruptcy in the UK. And with that, 700 people lost their jobs. And a company that had stood the test of time for 158 years of history, done. So what actually failed here? KNP is a transport company, right? Moving stuff in trucks is their business. Like I said, IT is expensive. It's a complicated thing that needs to be done, but it does not make money. So I'm willing to guess that if and when the IT team said, okay, we need MFA or we need to redo our backup strategy, what management would have heard is we got to spend more money on stuff that currently works and we are only possibly preventing problems that haven't happened yet. And this is how most non-tech companies think about IT, right? Security feels like a nice to have. It's not urgent. It's something to get to when there is a budget, when things are less busy, when there are no features to implement. The problem is IT is invisible, especially IT security is invisible until it seriously breaks down. Okay, you can't point to a ransomware attack that didn't happen, right? You have opportunities to implement security and you can implement them, but then how do you show it, right? You can't show what didn't happen. So you can have some basic work done to just check some boxes. Maybe you got a compliance certificate, maybe some cyber insurance, whatever. And you can do all that without actually doing the work, modernizing infrastructure. So I think that KNP, at least in some part of their mind, they thought that they had it covered. At least on paper, they were doing the responsible thing. They had backups. That's it, right? But there were massive gaps. Now, here's a fun statistic, all right? And this is something I looked up while I was researching for this video. 45% of all passwords in the world today can be cracked in under a minute with modern tools. 45%, almost half the passwords can be cracked in less than 1 minute. Okay, so the only thing that's stopping someone from gaining access to an account is not that they don't know the password. It is other steps that you put in place, like multi-factor authentication, or perhaps some kind of rate limiting, so that you can't just keep guessing passwords and just you get unlimited tries. That's not going to happen. Those are the things that's stopping people, not the complexity of the password or the difficulty of knowing about the password itself. And what's crazy is a lot of people have more common passwords, which makes it even simpler. If your password is among the common password list, you can crack it in under 1 second. And about 80% of the breaches in 2023 to 2024, I don't have the data for the 24 to 25 year, but the year before, 80% of security breaches involved compromised credentials. This is the easy way to break into systems, right? Why would an attacker spend weeks trying to figure out zero-day vulnerabilities while they can just crack passwords, right? Just try password 123. Someone has it, and some password is going to work. Yeah? This is problem number one. Okay, password is a problem. And secondly, I want to talk about backups. Network accessible backups are convenient because IT can restore files quickly. They can run automated jobs overnight. And for decades, this was fine for basically hardware failures or when user genuinely makes a mistake, like run a delete query across all tables, right? Yes, having an accessible backup makes sense. But ransomware isn't like that. Ransomware isn't a hardware failure. It's an adversarial attack where someone's actively trying to prevent your recovery. So if backups are done in the same network that got compromised, they're not really backups. It's just an additional target. So what we need is what are called air-gapped immutable backups, and they're designed to survive ransomware. This is relatively recent, last 5 to 7 years, right? So retrofitting that is expensive. It is disruptive, and it probably requires budget approval for some company like KNP. I'm willing to bet that someone in KNP said, yeah, we should update our backup strategy, and it went into the backlog because there were other things that were more urgent. So technical debt accumulates, security debt accumulates, and that's how stuff like this happens. Now, the third thing that I want to talk about is defense in depth. One password with admin rights could access everything. There was no network segmentation. There was no MFA, no air-gapped backups. One single point of failure took down the entire company. And this is what a lot of companies have. IT infrastructure that grew organically over the years, and it's no air-gapped backups. You need air-gapped backups, right? You have two things. There needs to be a gap of air so that someone who has compromised this part cannot jump and compromise this part as well. That's what air-gapped backup means. KNP had backups, and they thought, this is fine, and they check the boxes, but that does not protect against ransomware. This story matters because, well, the vulnerability, the attack itself is ridiculously simple. It's not glamorous. They just guessed a password. How boring is that? But I feel like KNP wasn't uniquely bad at security. In my estimate, they were probably average. They were average in security. I don't think they were extremely bad. The problem is average isn't good enough anymore. Now, let's talk about the attackers for a minute. I started researching this and I went down a rabbit hole. This is so fascinating that I've actually made a follow-up video about just this business that you should check out after watching this. So Akira first showed up in March of 2023. And they have been pretty prolific since then. They have had major attacks on Nissan Oceania. That was a company that attack affected about like 100,000 people. They've attacked multiple healthcare systems, and now KNP. Now, here's what's important to understand. Akira operates as ransomware as a service, which is exactly what it sounds like. Ransomware as a service. Here's how it works. So Akira has developers who build and maintain a ransomware platform, okay? The malware itself, the encryption tools, the payment infrastructure, the data leak sites where they threaten to publish stolen data if you don't pay. That's all infrastructure that Akira developers maintain. and they have affiliates, right? These are people who actually conduct the attacks. The affiliates get access to the platform, and then they go find vulnerable targets and they break in and deploy the ransomware. And when someone pays, the affiliate gets most of the money, usually like 70 to 80%, and Akira takes a cut because they're providing the platform. It's mind blowing. This is like franchise ransomware, right? So this means that you don't have to be a sophisticated hacker. You just need to find vulnerable systems and deploy the tools. So the hard part, building ransomware, building the payment infrastructure, the operational security, this was all handled by the platform. So this has actually lowered the barrier for entry for cybercrime. Okay? You don't need to be a developer. You don't need to understand cryptography. You just need to know how to find systems without MFA. Like in this case, just guess some passwords. So what makes Akira particularly effective is that their playbook, which is the methodology that the affiliates follow when they use their platform, is really, really methodical. The affiliates just don't smash and grab. The Akira platform actually has guides, and it actually encourages them to spend days and weeks inside of your network before deploying the ransomware. They encourage to map everything out, figure out what the critical systems are, which is exactly what these folks did, right? So this platform has a step-by-step manual for how to maximize the damage and make the recovery nearly impossible. I was shocked when I read this, and I hope you are shocked too, because this is a whole new level that they've taken cybercrime to. The average ransom demand in the UK is around £4 million, and about 1/3 of the organizations end up paying. Imagine that. 1/3 of the people affected pay these folks, costs up to £4 million. That's a pretty good conversion rate if you're running a criminal enterprise. Now, here is the broader context that makes this even more concerning. The whole ransomware business is now a $20 billion annual industry globally. That's $20 billion. That's bigger than a lot of legitimate software companies. And it's fully industrialized. There are specialized services for everything. You have initial access brokers who sell compromised credentials on underground markets. You have money laundering services that clean up cryptocurrency. You get ransom. How do you make that clean money? Well, you got out-of-the-box services for that. You even have negotiation consultants who help victims work through the payment process. This is a complete ecosystem. The UK National Crime Agency is handling about 35 to 40 new ransomware cases per week, and that's about double what it was in 2023. Last year, around 19,000 UK businesses were hit by ransomware, and the major 2025 victims include some really, really profitable, pharmacy companies, medical companies, and even popular companies like Comcast, and their data is compromised, their customers' data is compromised. In case of medical agencies, patients' data is compromised, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. And here's what I think is important for us as people who build software to understand. We are not fighting individual hackers anymore. We are up against industrialized, professionalized cybercrime as a service platforms. These guys have business models. They have SLAs. They have professional development. This is what we are competing against. We have hackers working in companies who have organizational structures, and they're running agile sprints. And companies here are treating security like it's 2010, right? The sophistication gap is very real, and it is widening all the time. All right, and here's where I'm going to get direct with you. 2/3 of organizations experienced ransomware attacks in 2023. Right? And there's a lot of money that goes into security tools, okay? But in spite of all this, credential-based attack remain the number one entry point. We're buying all these fancy security cameras, and we're leaving the front door open with credential attacks being the possible vulnerability. And the thing is, most of this isn't even hard. MFA with something like Okta or Auth0, that's literally enabling a feature. Password policies, you just configure it once and you're done. Network segmentation requires a little more work. I accept that. There is operational setup required. But you're building a system which is going to service customers. You're holding on to their data. You have the responsibility, right? Of course, you've got deadlines. Of course, you've got pressure to ship features. But implementing authentication systems and making it secure is not overhead. Yes, it's not exciting. It's not what the customers ask. It feels like friction. The problem isn't complexity, it is prioritization. right? These don't make it into sprint because there's always a feature that seems a little more important. And when they do get done, it's what they call security theater, right? Do we have MFA? Yes, it's available, but is it enforced? No, it's optional. Nobody uses it. Well, then you don't have MFA. Do you have backups? Yes, we have backups, but are they air gapped? Have you tested about lateral movements? I don't know. This is the problem, right? I feel like as developers, authentication is our responsibility, not the security teams, right? We are the ones implementing login flows, and we should decide when to require MFA. Every time we skip this because it adds friction or it's not priority, we are making an architectural choice. Whether we have the authority to implement it doesn't matter, but we have the responsibility to at least call it out and bring it up. And I get that many developers want to do the right thing and organizations make it hard. What gets measured is what features you have shipped, right? What velocity you have, what's the time to market. You cannot demo the fact that we didn't get hacked, right? That's not going to work. And you're not going to get promoted based on incidents prevented, because again, that cannot be measured. But the organization and us developers as a whole are collectively responsible for it. The problem with KNP was not because one person chose a bad password. It failed because the organizational structure made that failure possible. No one incentivized building the right system so that people have no choice but to create proper passwords. You can't blame the guy who chose the wrong password. You got to blame the company because they let that happen. Enough of doom and gloom, right? Let's talk about what you can actually do. Because the good news is that, again, like I said, this isn't complicated. This is just rarely prioritized. So here are some things that we should have as our checklist, all right? First of all, MFA. We have to have MFA. Yes, MFA adds friction and users will complain. But if someone guesses your password and your entire company is gone, that is a little more friction, don't you think? And I don't mean like SMS codes. I mean proper MFA, right? Either using some kind of OAuth mechanism or something like that. And you don't need to build this yourself. In fact, you shouldn't build this yourself. You should use some off-the-shelf solution that's battle tested and supports modern standards. They're certainly going to be more secure than whatever you're going to build in-house. Secondly, zero trust architecture. Traditional network security in the olden days, they used to call it, it's like candy, right? Hard shell on the outside and soft inside. Once you break through the hard shell, everything trusts you. Well, that's not feasible in today's day and age. Today's day and age, you got to do zero trust, which basically says trust nothing. Just assume a breach. Assume that someone is already inside your network. Someone will get the credentials and get inside. Design so that when that happens, they can't move free. So network location is not an authentication factor, right? Every request will get verified every time, regardless of where it came from, even if it comes within the network. And for microservices, you use a service mesh with mutual TLS, right? You use some kind of a verification process so that every service verifies the identity of every other service. You cannot trust a request just because it came from inside a network. Everything needs to be authenticated. And for APIs, you got to use OAuth authentication or some kind of a valid OIDC flow, and not just API keys sitting in environment variables or sitting in some environment file somewhere. And then the principle of least privilege. You know what happened in KNP? I'm going to guess. The hijacked account almost certainly had way more access than it needed. It's probably super privileged, right? Access to everything. And I can imagine how that conversation went because I've heard this 1,000 times. One employee comes and says, I need admin access to do one little thing. And IT says, no, you need specific access. Tell me exactly what you need. I'm going to give you access only to that. And then the manager goes to the IT team and says, well, you're blocking my employee from doing my job. This is taking so long. And the IT team says, okay, fine. Here you go. Full access to everything. And guess what? When someone hacks into their account, now they have access to everything, right? So that becomes a skeleton key to your entire infrastructure. And one password guess, and the attacker has access to everything, which is literally what happened with the KNP incident. So the fix, you use least privilege, role-based access controls. Just give people the access that they need. And if someone needs elevated access, it should be time bound. They have to request it and they get it for a couple of hours and then it expires. And same thing for service accounts. Service accounts should have exactly the permissions that they need for the specific function and nothing more. So this requires people saying no a lot. You have to push back. The IT has to push back. Management team has to push back. And that is the hard part. And the other thing you need to do is network segmentation, right? Breaking the different tiers of infrastructure to be isolated from each other. Web servers shouldn't be in direct access with the database server, right? Development environment shouldn't be able to reach production. Backups should definitely not be accessible from the network that could potentially compromise it, right? So this is called microsegmentation. So making lateral movements should be difficult. It should be difficult. If someone gets in, they shouldn't be able to freely wander around your entire infrastructure. So there's this concept about east-west trafficking. The east-west is like the horizontal traffic between different points in your network. That should be difficult, not just the north-south traffic. We are very good at securing the north-south traffic, user to system, but system to system should also be very secure. And finally, backups. KNP had backups. I'm guessing the backup jobs ran possibly every night. Everything showed green in the monitoring dashboard, but they should be air-gapped. And there is this 3-2-1-1 rule for the ransomware era backups. 3-2-1-1. 3 copies of your data, 2 different media types, 1 offsite, and 1 air-gapped or immutable. Last one is the key, air-gapped. It means physically or logically isolated from your production network in a way that production credentials can't reach. Some people do immutable backups with like immutable S3 buckets with completely separate IAM credentials, right? Not in the same AWS account, but in a different one entirely, right? This kind of stuff you can do so that if an attacker has domain admin on your production network, they should not be able to delete your backups. And it goes without saying, the backups have to be working backups. When was the last time you actually tested restoring from them? You have a backup, but can you get data in case you need it? Many people don't know. Many companies don't know, right? This is something that many companies discover when they have an actual incident, and the backup has been silently corrupting for months. Security can't be an afterthought. It has to be architectural. You have to do threat modeling in the design phase. Security requirements have to be in the acceptance criteria. When you're writing an architectural document, security considerations should be a part of it. So yes, secure systems are harder to build. They're slower to ship and more expensive up front, but bankruptcies are a little more expensive. There has to be a balance. You can't go too much on the other side as well. You can't say, I'm going to spend so much time securing things and not releasing features. That's a problem too. You got to have a balance, all right? It's very hard to tell people, 700 people, that they lost their jobs because you didn't secure your system right. And especially with the kind of hacking, the kind of organized cybercrime that's happening right now, it's necessary. You have to do it. I think it's just a matter of time before every one of the organizations that's open on the internet will hit some kind of an attack or another because of the scale at which these folks are operating. So you have to know that it's coming at some point and you got to be ready for it. Sure, you can optimize for speed and resilience, move fast and break things, great, but you can't break a 150-year-old company with 700 people's livelihoods. The problem is that security is off the main path, right? It's not a feature request from customers. It's not in the product roadmap. It's not something that gets assigned in sprint planning. It often requires someone to step up and say, hey, we need to do this, and then actually drive it. That someone could be the CTO, it could be the tech lead, it could be the junior developer who just reads about a ransomware attack and gets worried. It could be you who's watched this video now and gets worried. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that someone takes the initiative instead of waiting to be told. And this is the problem with many organizations today, which are full of order takers. Everyone is waiting for someone else to prioritize security, right? Developers are waiting for leadership to make it a priority. Leadership is waiting for customers to demand it or some kind of a government regulation. Security teams are waiting for developers to ask for help. Meanwhile, you don't have MFA, you don't have security implemented properly because no one took ownership of making it happen. So my recommendation to you is, regardless of your role, be the person who steps up. Be the person who says, we should fix it. If your senior leader says no or your manager shuts it down, it's on them. But it's your responsibility as a software professional to try to make it happen. So don't wait for it to be assigned to you, because if everyone's waiting, it'll never happen. 158 years of history and 700 people losing their jobs. And it's gone in 3 weeks because someone guessed a password. I think that's a lesson there for all of us.